Cumberland Plateau, Tennessee, autumn 1943. A German officer holds a metal tray in both hands. On it is more meat than a German family was allowed to buy in a month. Behind the counter, an American boy of 19 is already looking past him at the next man in line. He is bored. He does not know he is winning the war right now, standing still, holding a ladle. And 3,000 miles away, in a camp in Germany, an American airman is eating a piece of bread the size of his palm. And the only reason he is eating anything at all is what is happening on this tray in this room in Tennessee. Nobody in this building understands that yet. This is not a story about kindness. This is a story about what the men behind that wire figured out before they finished the first plate. Tunisia, May the 13th, 1943. The war in North Africa ended not with a battle, but with an exhaustion. Along the roads out of Cape Bon, the surviving formations of Army Group Africa walked into captivity in long gray columns that stretched past the horizon, and the men in those columns had not eaten properly in weeks. The supply convoys had stopped coming. The aircraft had stopped coming. Somewhere in Berlin, the maps still showed arrows and formations, but here on the Tunisian coast, there were only men and dust and the sound of boots. Gerhard Hennes was a young officer of the Wehrmacht, which meant he had been trained to command men and to believe certain things about the world. And on that day, both of those trainings ended at the same moment. He surrendered with the rest. He was searched, counted, and marked down in a ledger. His name became a number in a system he had not known existed until it closed around him. He would not see Germany again for 3 years. What followed was not a journey so much as a slow disassembly. 5 months of it, holding pens in North Africa where the sun came down like a weight. Transit cages where men slept in the open and woke covered in fine white dust. 12 different facilities, each one a set of wire and a queue for water, each one indistinguishable from the last. He was moved by truck, by rail, by ship. He crossed the Atlantic in the hold of an American cargo vessel that had come east loaded with the machinery of war and was returning west empty. And so the Germans became the cargo on the return leg. That was the arithmetic of it. They filled space that would otherwise have been wasted. Somewhere in the middle of that ocean, Gerhard Hennes stopped thinking about the war and started thinking about food. This is what hunger does. It is patient. It hollows a man out slowly, and then it moves into the space it has made, and it begins to furnish it. By the time the ship reached the American coast, the men in the hold had stopped talking about strategy and grand designs. They talked about bread. They talked about their mother's kitchens. They argued about the correct preparation of a dish none of them had eaten in 2 years and would probably never eat again. They came ashore on the eastern seaboard of the United States in the autumn of 1943, and the first thing that happened to them was the thing none of them ever forgot. They were put on a train, not a freight car, not a cattle wagon, a passenger train. Surplus American rolling stock, the sort of coach a civilian might have ridden before the war, with upholstered seats and windows that looked out onto the world. The prisoners filed aboard in silence, and they sat down on cushions, and some of them ran their hands along the fabric of the seat backs the way a man touches something he does not believe is real. Then the train began to move west, and it kept moving. Hours became a day became 2. The land outside the window went on and would not stop going on. Fields, rivers, towns with unbombed churches and streetlights that worked. Factories with their lights burning through the night, throwing yellow across the rails, and then more fields, and then more factories. It was too much. It broke some in their sense of scale, and because men will always defend the shape of the world they already carry, some of them began to insist that it was a trick. The Americans were driving the trains in circles. They were routing them back and forth over the same ground to make the country appear larger than it was. Somewhere out there, past the edge of this staged landscape, the real America was small and thin and running out. They said this to each other in low voices. They said it with conviction. None of them believed it. The train carried them south and west, through Virginia, through Tennessee, up onto a high shelf of land called the Cumberland Plateau, where the air turned cool and the forest closed in on both sides of the track. And in the last hours of that journey, Gerhard Hennes looked out the window at a country he had been told for 4 years was decadent, exhausted, and on the edge of collapse. And the country in the window would not agree with the country he had been described. The town was called Crossville. The camp sat on land that had been taken. This is a detail most tellings leave out, and it should not be left out, because it is the first true thing about the place. The ground the barracks stood on had belonged to a man named Amos Wilkes, a former United States Marshal, and in 1941, the federal government bought it from him. He did not want to sell. He was not a man looking for a wartime windfall. He said no. And the government took it anyway, because that is what governments do when there is a war on. And the sales went through over his objection. So before a single German prisoner arrived at Crossville, the war had already reached into an American life and taken something out of it. The camp took its first prisoners in November of 1942. Those men were Italians and Germans captured earlier in the North African campaign. The AfriCorp veterans, the men who had surrendered in Tunisia, did not arrive until the second half of 1943. Over the life of the camp, roughly 1,500 prisoners passed through it, and the local people watching the trucks come up the road, watching the wire go up, arrived at their own conclusion about who was inside. They called it the Jap camp. There was never a single Japanese prisoner at Crossville. Not one. We will come back to that name because it matters more than it looks. Gerhard Hans walked through the gate of Camp Crossville in the autumn of 1943, 5 months after Tunisia, and he was still wearing what was left of the uniform he had surrendered in. He weighed considerably less than he had a year earlier, and he was about to be handed a tray. The mess hall was warm. That was the first thing. After the hold of the ship, after the transit cages, after months of sleeping in the open, the simple fact of a heated room with a roof on it registered in the body before the mind caught up. There was steam in the air. There was a smell. Coffee, real coffee, bread that had been baked that day. The men shuffled forward in the line, and the American behind the serving counter began to fill the trays. And here's where the story is usually told badly. It is usually told as a moment of shock and tears. It was not at first. The strangest thing in that room was not the abundance. It was the boredom. The soldier serving the food was not making a gesture. He was not performing generosity or contempt or anything at all. He was doing a job he had done that morning and would do again that evening, moving the ladle without looking at it, thinking about something else entirely. The portions went onto the trays with the mechanical evenness of a man who had stopped seeing what he was handling. That is the detail that should go through you like cold water, because it went through them. Because a feast can be staged. A feast is a message, and a soldier knows how to defend himself against a message. But you cannot stage boredom. Boredom is what abundance looks like when it has been going on so long that nobody notices it anymore. The tray in his hands was heavier than he expected. Meat, bread, white and soft, vegetables, coffee that was actually coffee, not roasted barley pretending to be coffee. And behind the serving counter, through an open doorway, he could see into the kitchen, where more Americans in white were assembling more trays exactly like his, hundreds of them, on and on. An operation running at a scale that had nothing to do with him or with any of the men in that line. He was not being fed a message. He was being fed lunch. And that word is the whole story. Not a feast, not a gesture, lunch. An ordinary midday meal in an ordinary American mess hall, assembled without ceremony, handed across a counter by a boy who was thinking about something else. And it was more food than these men had seen in a year. Whatever the Americans called it that day, they did not call it generous. They did not call it anything at all. That is what broke more German soldiers than any bombing raid ever did. Somewhere in the room, a man was crying. Somewhere else, a man was eating too fast and would be sick within the hour. Most of them simply sat and looked at the tray and did not move, because there is a specific paralysis that comes over a starving man when the food is finally in front of him and he does not yet trust it. We do not know what Gerhard Hens thought while he ate that first meal. He wrote a book about his captivity 60 years later, but no man remembers his own mind that precisely, and I am not going to invent it for you. What we know is what was on the tray. And we know what these men had spent 4 years being told. Production figures, tonnage, the industrial capacity of the enemy, always described as inflated, always described as propaganda, always described as a bluff that would collapse the moment the war went long. And here was a number a man could actually verify, sitting on a metal tray in front of him, in a camp in the mountains of Tennessee on an ordinary Tuesday. If this was what they gave their prisoners without thinking about it, what did they give their soldiers? And if that was true, then what exactly had these men been fighting? Nobody said it out loud, not that day. And this is not the story of men who saw a plate of food and became Democrats by nightfall. That is not how a mind works, and it is not what happened here. What arrived first, after the shock, was not enlightenment, it was shame. Not for him specifically. I have no letter from his mother, and I will not write one. But across that mess hall sat men who all knew the same thing. Germany was on ration cards. People at home were eating turnips and calling them something else. And these men were sitting in a warm room in Tennessee with more on the tray than their families had seen in a month, and they had done nothing to earn it except lose. That is the feeling that actually breaks men, not the abundance, the comparison. Now, why? Why did the United States do this? Why feed the enemy at all? And why feed him like this in the middle of a war, while American civilians at home were counting stamps in a ration book for meat and sugar and coffee? The answer is not kindness. The answer has nothing to do with kindness. It was a piece of paper signed in Geneva in 1929, which required that prisoners of war be given food, shelter, and clothing on the same standard as the troops of the capturing power. Not a similar standard, the same one. And the United States, which by the end of the war would hold 371,000 German prisoners on its own soil, followed that requirement with a rigidity that infuriated a great many of its own citizens. But there was a second reason underneath the first, and it was colder than the paper. There were American boys in German hands. Airmen shot down over the Reich, infantry taken in Italy, in Tunisia, later in the hedgerows of Normandy, thousands of them, sitting behind German wire, entirely at the mercy of a government that had already demonstrated what it was capable of when it decided the rules did not apply. The Americans knew, everyone knew, that on the Eastern Front, the rules had been abandoned completely, that German and Soviet prisoners were being worked to death and shot in the tens of thousands, and nobody was writing any of it down. So every tray handed across that counter in Crossville, Tennessee, was a bet. It said, "We are treating your men well. We are documenting that we are treating your men well. The Red Cross is watching us treat your men well. Now look at what you are holding." That is what Gerhard Hennes was actually eating. He was eating the leverage the United States was applying 3 times a day to keep American pilots alive in Stalag camps 3,000 miles away. The generosity was real. The motive was not sentimental. Both of these things are true at once, and any version of this story that picks only one of them is lying to you. There was one more thing about Camp Crossville that separated it from every other camp in the American system, and it was the thing that would shape the next 2 years of Gerhard Hennes's life more than the food ever did. The United States operated a network of roughly 155 prisoner of war camps across the country. Crossville was designated an officers' camp, and according to the University of Tennessee's own record of the place, the only one in the system to carry that designation officially. This sounds like a privilege. In the beginning, the men believed it was, but that designation carried a second consequence on. One none of them saw coming, and it had nothing to do with food. At Crossville, the officers stayed inside. They had their rations, they had their barracks, they had 2 years of empty hours stretching out in front of them on a plateau in Tennessee with nothing to do but talk and think and watch each other. Hundreds of men, no work, no wages, no horizon, and among them a hardcore who had run the same arithmetic over that first tray, and who had decided immediately and violently that the correct response to that arithmetic was to make certain nobody said it out loud. The wire around Camp Crossville was there to keep the Germans in. It was about to become clear that the Germans had built a second one on the inside, and that the men who ran it were far less interested in escape than in obedience. The war was over for these men. What was starting was something else. Winter came early to the Cumberland Plateau that first year. Wind came off the ridges at night and found every gap in the barracks siding, and the men lay in their bunks listening to it, and there was nothing to get up for in the morning. That was the shape of it. Officers of the German army, well-fed, warm enough, entirely idle, stacked into wooden buildings on a mountain in Tennessee, with 2 years in front of them and nothing to fill it. A man can survive hunger. Hunger gives him something to do. Idleness is different. Idleness leaves the mind free, and a free mind in a prison camp starts looking around for something to hold on to. And in the barracks at Crossville, there was something waiting to be held on to, and it had rules. Here is the thing that almost nobody expects. The dangerous man at Camp Crossville was not the American with the rifle in the tower. The guards were, for the most part, ordinary young soldiers doing an ordinary job. Some of them bored, some of them decent, most of them counting days. The guards were not what these men needed to be afraid of. The dangerous man was the German sitting across the table. 'Cause every officer in that camp had run the arithmetic. They were not stupid men. They were professional soldiers trying to draw conclusions from it. And they had all crossed that continent on the same train and watched the same factories go past the same windows for 2 days without end. They had all seen the kitchen behind the serving counter. They all knew. And knowing was the problem, because if the abundance was real, then the propaganda was false. And if the propaganda was false, then the war was lost. And if the war was lost, then every man who had died under their command had died for a miscalculation. There is no way to live inside that thought, so a great many of them chose not to. Inside those barracks, a second authority assembled itself out of nothing but rank and conviction. The hardcore, the committed ones, the ones for whom the oath was still the oath, took control of the internal life of the compound. They ran the barracks. They decided who sat where. They watched who was learning English and who was reading American newspapers and who lingered too long in conversation with a guard. They were not guarding the camp. They were guarding the belief. A man who said the wrong thing at the wrong found himself alone. Then he found his belongings disturbed. Then he found that no one would speak to him at all, and in a compound with no work and no wages and no way out, being unspoken to is not a small thing. It is the whole world going quiet. Across the American camp system, and I want to be precise here because I have no record of a killing at Crossville itself. This went further than silence. There were beatings. There were men found hanged who had not hanged themselves. There were secret tribunals convened inside barracks buildings by prisoners, passing sentence on other prisoners on American soil. 14 German prisoners were eventually executed by the United States at Fort Leavenworth in July of 1945 for murders they had committed inside American camps. The Wehrmacht had crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a cargo ship, and it had brought its discipline with it. So the guards at Crossville were not the last line between a German officer and violence. They were, for some of those men, the only one. And there was another cruelty in the officer camp, one the men had not seen coming, and it came directly out of the privilege they had been so pleased about. Officers could not be required to work. At the other camps, at Camp Forest down near Tullahoma, where nearly twice as many Germans were held, at the depot at Memphis, at camps across the whole breadth of the country, enlisted prisoners went out through the gates in the morning. They cut timber on the plateau. They brought in cotton. They worked the farms of Tennessee for farmers whose own sons were in the Pacific. And at midday, somebody's wife brought food out to the field, and they ate it under a tree, and then they went back to work. They were paid for it, not much, enough. And with that money, they walked into the camp canteen and they bought things. That canteen was the second great shock of the American War, and in some ways it was worse than the mess hall. Cigarettes, soap, soft drinks, ice cream, ordinary goods stacked on ordinary shelves in ordinary quantities, the same goods that disappeared from German shops in 1941 and never come back. A German enlisted man in Tennessee, a prisoner of war, could buy ice cream with money he had earned in a country he had been sent to destroy, while his mother in Hamburg queued for bread. At Crossville, the officers had none of it. No work, no wage, no cant, teen money worth speaking of. They had the food, and the food was the same, and the food was the point of the whole story. But the food was all they had. The enlisted men had exhaustion and a paycheck and a reason to be tired at the end of the day. The officers had time. Hundreds of men sitting in barracks, being right about the war and unable to say so. They organized courses. They organized theater. They played football on the ground and inside the wire. They painted and they rode. And Gerhard Hens, an officer of a defeated army sitting on a mountain in a country he had been tossed, began slowly over months to learn the language of the people who had captured him. That was not heroism. Let us be clear about that. It was something far more ordinary and far more human. It was something to do. Down the mountain, the town of Crossville went on calling it Jap Camp. That never changed. For the entire life of the installation, local people used a name that had no connection whatsoever to the men inside it. There was never a Japanese prisoner at Crossville, not one. The camp held Germans and Italians, Europeans to the last man, and the people of Cumberland County looked at it and saw the Pacific. Sit with that for a moment. Because the Germans behind that wire had spent 4 years being told a story about America that turned out to be false, and it had taken a tray of food to break it. And the Americans on the other side of the same wire were walking around with a story of their own that was equally false, and nothing had broken it at all, because nothing needed to. It cost them nothing to be wrong. Their war was going to be won regardless of what they called the camp on the hill. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. Nobody in it had accurate information. Not the prisoners. Not the townspeople. The difference between them was never intelligence, and it was never virtue. It was production. And then there were the escapes, and they were not what the movies made of them. The first 2 men to run were not even at a camp yet. They went out of a train window on the way to Camp Forest in November of 1942, and they were picked up a few days later. But the one people still tell in Tennessee is the other one. An Afrika Korps veteran walked out of Camp Forest, just walked out. And he did not head for the woods, and he did not head for the coast, and he did not try to reach a submarine off the Carolinas. He walked into the town of Tullahoma, and he bought a ticket, and he caught the 9:25 train to Nashville. And in Nashville, this German soldier, an enemy combatant at large in the interior of the United States in the middle of the Second World War, went out drinking. He went out drinking with an American GI on leave. The 2 of them went from bar to bar in Nashville, Tennessee, and the American had no idea. Not a clue. They drank together, and they talked together, and they parted, and the German was picked up the next day in a routine check, and that was the end of it. Another man got out of Crossville and stayed out for months because he spoke the language well enough to simply be a person walking around America. And here is why these stories are not comedy, or not only comedy. Every one of those men could have run. Some of them had the language, some of them had the nerve, and what did they do with it? One of them went to a bar, because there was nowhere to escape to. Germany was 3,000 miles across a submarine-hunted ocean, and it was losing. The country they were standing in went on for 2 days at 40 miles an hour. There was no line to reach, front to rejoin, no version of freedom available at the far end of that fence. So a man walked out through the wire and found that the outside was just America, enormous and indifferent and full of beer, and after a night of it, he let himself be taken back. That is not a prison break. That is a man checking whether the world he had been told about actually existed. It did not. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wire, America was getting angry, not at the Germans, at its own government, because the story had gotten out. Word traveled from farm crews, from delivery drivers, from civilians who worked inside the camps and went home at night to towns like Crossville, where a woman named Erlene Chandler Ferris, in her 20s, worked as a secretary at the prisoner of war camp, typing the paperwork of an operation the whole county was talking about. And what the country heard was this: the enemy was being lead-fed steak. Americans were living on ration books. Meat was rationed. Sugar was rationed. Coffee was rationed. Gold Star Flagstaff flags were going up in windows in every state, and mothers who had buried nothing but a telegram were reading that German prisoners in Arizona and Texas and Tennessee were eating hot meals 3 times a day, watching films, playing football, and getting medical care. They gave it a name. They called the camps the Fritz Ritz. It became a political fight. Newspapers ran it. Congressmen got letters, sacks of them. At one camp out west, American personnel formally demanded the removal of their own commanding officer, accusing him of coddling and catering to the Germans while treating his own men badly. And the Army's answer, when it finally came, was not an apology. The Army said the criticism came from people who did not understand the Geneva Convention or international law. And a congressional investigation responding to a furious public put it in words should be carved somewhere. This is not a question of Army policy. It is a question of law. Read that again and understand what it actually meant to the man who received the letter back. It meant, your son is starving in a camp in Germany, and the only thing standing between him and something worse is the fact that we are not doing it here. We are not feeding these men because we like them. We are feeding them because the day we stop, your boy stops eating too. That was the deal. It was never generosity. It was a hostage exchange conducted in calories, and the American public was told to swallow it, and mostly they did. By the end of 1944, the men inside Camp Crossville knew. The letters from home said it, even through the censors. Thinner handwriting, shorter paragraphs, a brother drafted, a street that no longer existed, a mother writing carefully around the word hungry and failing. They were reading those letters in a warm room with full stomachs on a mountain in Tennessee. And the last defense, the hardcore in the barracks, the men who ran the internal courts, the ones who insisted the abundance was a trick, began to lose the argument. Not because anyone converted them. Nobody stood up and made a speech. It was simpler and sadder than that. The mail kept coming. Every letter was a small piece of evidence, and there were hundreds of men receiving them. And eventually, there is no barracks discipline strong enough to hold a line against that many mothers. The Germans at Crossville stopped arguing about whether Germany would lose. They started thinking about what would be waiting for them when they got back. And then it was April of 1945, and the American newsreels began showing something that would take every one of them, prisoner and guard and townsperson alike, and put them on entirely new ground. On the 4th of April, 1945, American soldiers of the Third Army walked into a place in Thuringia called Ohrdruf. They were young men from Ohio and Alabama and Pennsylvania, and they had been fighting across Europe for the better part of a year, and they believed by then that they had seen the worst thing there was to see. They had not. What they found at Ohrdruf was a camp the SS had emptied days before, driving the prisoners west on foot and killing roughly 1,000 of them along the road. The men, too sick to walk, had been shot where they lay. The mass graves had been reopened and the bodies burned badly and in a hurry, because someone had understood that the Americans were coming and that this had to disappear. It did not disappear. 11 days later, on the 15th of April, the British walked into Bergen-Belsen and found 60,000 people still alive, most of them starving and sick beyond help, and 13,000 dead, lying unburied in the open. And then the photographs came home. They ran in the newspapers, they ran in the newsreels, in theaters in every town in America, between the cartoon and the feature, and men who had been reading for 2 years about German prisoners eating steak in Tennessee sat in the dark and watched what those prisoners' army had actually built. And this time, something did change on the trays, and it changed by order. In the spring of 1945, with the photographs in every paper and the public past the point of tolerance, the War Department cut the prisoners' rations. The menus came down. The meat came down. The Fritz Ritz closed. It was not revenge. It was arithmetic again. The German front was collapsing. American prisoners were being liberated by the week, and the hostage exchange conducted in calories was running out of anything left to protect. The war was all but won. Everybody knew it. The wire, the towers, the counting, all of it had become procedure. But something in the room had gone cold, and it never warmed up again. Now hold two pictures side by side, because this is the part that matters, and it is the part almost nobody tells you. The first picture is Camp Crossville, Tennessee, in the spring of 1945. German officers behind wire, warm barracks, 3 meals a day served on schedule because the Geneva Convention said so, and because the United States Army had decided that the law was the law. The second picture is the West Bank of the Rhine in Germany at the exact same moment. By April of 1945, the German army in the West had stopped being an army and become a flood. Hundreds of thousands of men surrendering in a week, then 1 million, then more. And in March, before the flood arrived, a decision had been made at the top of the Allied command. The men taken on German soil at the end would not be classified as prisoners of war. They would be called disarmed enemy forces. The distinction was not academic. Prisoner of war was a legal category with obligations attached: food, shelter, clothing, all of it at the standard of the capturing army. Disarmed enemy forces was a category with none of that. They were put into open fields ringed with wire, the Rhine meadow camps. Between 1 and nearly 2 million men from April to September, with almost nothing built for them, sleeping in holes they dug themselves in the mud through a wet European spring. From April through July, the rations there were starvation rations. And here I have to stop and say something plainly, because this is ground where a great deal of nonsense has been planted. You may have heard that this was deliberate extermination, that 1 million men were murdered by design in those meadows. That claim comes from a book published in 1989 called Other Losses, and it has been examined by historians and rejected. The principal rebuttal, Eisenhower and the German POWs. Facts Against Falsehood was published in 1992 specifically to answer it. The Rhine Meadow camps were a catastrophe of logistics and a genuine moral failure. Men died there who should not have. But the death figures in that book are not supported, and I will not repeat them to you as fact. What is true is enough. Same army, same year, same uniform on the men behind the wire. In Tennessee, a hot meal 3 times a day on a metal tray. On the Rhine, a hole in the ground and a hunger you could die in. The difference was not virtue. Americans were not better people in Crossville than they were at Remagen. The difference was that in Tennessee there was food, and there were buildings, and there was a functioning legal machine with the Red Cross watching it. And in Germany, in April of 1945, a continent had been eaten down to the bone, and there was not enough of anything for anybody. That is the whole lesson, and it is not a comfortable one. Decency, a feeling. Decency is infrastructure. It survives exactly as long as the surplus that pays for it, and not one day longer. Gerhard Hennens did not get a tray in Tennessee because someone loved him. He got it because America still had it to give. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. At Crossville, the news arrived, and there was no celebration and no riot. There was mostly silence. And then there was the ordinary business of men absorbing that the thing which had organized their entire adult lives was simply over, and that they had lost, and that they were still here. The camp closed in December of 1945. Repatriation took time. It took most of another year for the system to run itself backward. Hundreds of thousands of men moved by train and by ship east across the same ocean into a country that no longer looked like the one in their letters. Gerhard Hennens went home. He had been a young man when he surrendered in Tunisia. He was 3 years older when he saw Germany again, and what he found there was rubble and hunger. And the hunger was worse than anything he had experienced as a prisoner of the United States. That is the fact that stayed with those men for the rest of their lives, and it is the fact that broke them. They had eaten better as captives of their enemy than their own mothers had eaten as citizens at home. And then, years later, a different life entirely, Gerhard Hennens became an American citizen, not out of gratitude. Do not make it sentimental. Men emigrate for 100 ordinary reasons, and he had spent 2 years learning the language on a mountain in Tennessee. And that is usually how these things actually happen. But in 2004, an old man sat down and wrote it all out and published it, and called the book The Barbed Wire. He was still thinking about it 60 years later. There is one more thing. The land that camps stood on, the land the federal government took from Amos Wilkes in 1941 over his objection, because there was a war on, and no was not an answer anyone was accepting that year. That land is still there. It is a 4-H center now, the Clyde York Center up on the Cumberland Plateau. Thousands of American kids go through it every summer. They shoot archery, they swim, they learn to work together, and they sit around at night the way children have always sat around at camp, and then they go home. And near the entrance, there is a long white building. Most of them have no idea what it was. Their counselors mostly don't either. It is just the old building by the gate, the one that has always been there, painted and repainted, with the paint going soft at the corners. It was the hospital. It was where they treated German prisoners of war. In the middle of the 20th century, in the middle of Tennessee, while the world came apart 3,000 miles away. They came up that road in the beds of trucks. They arrived starving and certain of things that were not true, and they were handed a tray by a bored young American who had done it so many times he had stopped seeing it. That was the whole battle. Right there, not a shot fired. A country that had enough knew it and had gotten so used to it that abundance had become boring. That is what beat them. And every one of them knew it before he finished the first plate.